Larry, why is knowledge this new source for creating competitive advantages?
Well, I think as the economy evolves, the global economy, knowledge has emerged as a true source of competitive advantage for nations. This has been for a number of reasons. One is the ubiquity and transparency and cheapness of information technology, which allows us to package certain forms of knowledge. Another reason is the growing complexity of the division of labor, global division of labor, with China and India becoming integrated into the world economy. A lot of activities that formerly were done by the nations that had these capacities have been passed on to, well, China and India, for example, leaving a lot of the more knowledge-intensive activities to the other economies. A third reason would be the aggregate growth of science and the need for much more scientific activity, the understanding of more scientific activity, and the growing dissemination of scientific and technical knowledge, which people need a base from which to start from. So there are three reasons.
What are knowledge assets? How do you measure them?
I probably would prefer the term knowledge resources, but generally a way of measuring them would be those knowledge assets that are codified, that can be put into books, blueprints, recipes, formulas that can be reused. Then there's the knowledge that's embodied in practices, surgery, teaching, ceramics, manufacturing are all practice knowledge. And you'd find that more in clumps of people who actually work in knowledge activities. So there would be two grand divisions, sort of the epistemic knowledge of science and things that can be codified, which you'd find more in universities, think tanks, government agencies, and practice knowledge, which you'd find more in manufacturing, in various type of practice activities, law, medicine, consulting.
So how can you use those knowledge assets to enhance competitiveness?
Well, there's a number of things you can do. You can make policy decisions that encourage people to study those areas that are more knowledge intensive, those subjects that seem to be emerging as competitive advantage type of subjects. For example, biotechnology would be one. Maybe software engineering would be another. Ceramics and new materials would be a third. That's one example. Another example would be to give tax incentives or various type of status awards or prizes for people who excel at these activities. A third would be to don't protect industries that don't have a vibrant future. Don't cave in, I guess, to political pressures to create protectionism for industries that aren't suitable for a country to create a competitive situation.
Mm-hmm. What is social capital?
Social capital are the rewards that accrue, the benefits that accrue to both an individual or an organization based on who they know. Now, people always say it's more important to who you know than what you know, and there's a lot of truth to that. So the rewards of trust, if you're trustful, those people who you trust and those who trust you, the social norms that accrue to individuals and to organizations of reciprocity, of good behavior, cooperative behavior, and the density and richness of the social networks of an organization, which both encourages and enables trust and social norms, and especially knowledge sharing. The social capital is very closely tied to knowledge and the knowledge-based activities. It's very, very hard to distinguish when you actually examine this, the differences between social capital and knowledge resources. The two things are very, very close.
This is maybe the same question. What is the relationship between knowledge and social capital?
Knowledge is a social activity. Knowledge itself is socially constructed and socially created. So anything that affects the social dimension of work and in the workplace would affect the knowledge of that activity.
Now, talking about the project, what are the main findings of the knowledge assets and the social capital project?
Well, certainly in the project done in Peru, one of the main findings is that the coordination between the knowledge of the people working to develop that asparagus cluster and the social relations they were involved in are intricately connected, and affecting one affected the other. Another find would be that the social knowledge as well as the technical knowledge was very important for those people to succeed. On the project done in Colombia, clearly the development of trust is crucial for that project to getting started, for that cluster to begin to emerge.
Given the lack of trust in most clusters in the Andean countries, is there any hope for our clusters to become more competitive?
I would say yes, Luis. I would think that there are examples in the literature and in our own life where trust can get established. Trust is contagious. When you trust others, those people tend to trust you. And it's a matter of critical mass and what was called a tipping point. If you get enough people to trust one another, take the chance, begin to entrust others, you can encourage levels of trust that could reach a point, a tipping point, where trust becomes pervasive. So yes, I think definitely. It's not easy. This is not an easy thing to do, but it can and has been done.
So finally, what are the lessons of the project for policymakers and businessmen?
Well, I think certainly some of them would be that the knowledge perspective is vital for a project to succeed. It's not always the same thing. You don't always do the same knowledge activity. But taking the perspective of what do we know, what do we need to know, what don't we know, who should know it, what are the responsibilities of people to work with knowledge would be absolutely vital for the success of these projects.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Luis.
John, why is knowledge the new source for creating competitive advantages?
Well, in a competitive global economy, I think organizations can succeed either by making something new or by making something less expensive than their competitors. In both of those cases, knowledge is an important ingredient. It's an ingredient in the efficiency of production, and of course, knowledge is the main source of kind of innovation driving a lot of commerce today.
What are knowledge assets? How do you measure them?
Knowledge assets include people's know-how, the abilities that people develop through experience to do work, people skills. There are also knowledge assets that seem more concrete. For instance, patents that describe new processes or discoveries are a kind of knowledge asset. And a company like IBM, for instance, is very proud of the fact that it produces more patents every year than another organization. The second kind of thing, the patents, can be easily measured, saying you have more than someone else. The first kind, and I would say the most important knowledge, is very difficult to measure. Sometimes people try to measure people's education. I'm not sure that measuring that knowledge is important. I think more important is trying to measure the effects of the knowledge, either in innovation produced, effectiveness or efficiency of processes, and the actual measuring of knowledge may not be very productive.
How can you use knowledge assets to enhance competitiveness?
Well, I've partly described an answer to that knowledge really can be the source either of efficiency, which obviously can enhance competitiveness in terms of increasing profitability, or in terms of sparking innovation. And I would say in general, since efficiency can be copied fairly quickly in most cases, that innovation has the potential for being the greatest source of competitive advantage. If you make something that no one has made before, that customers demand, I think that's important. I would say another thing that we haven't talked much about, knowledge of your market and knowledge of your customers can also be a source of competitive advantage. And although companies have talked in recent years about customer knowledge, actually they don't know much about their customers for the most part. And I think that's an area with a lot of potential still.
What is social capital?
I define social capital as the networks of personal relationships that individuals have, relationships that are characterized by mutual trust, by some degree of mutual understanding, and by what sociologists call generalized reciprocity. That is, not I will do this for you if you do it for me, but a kind of general faith that we have each other's goodwill at heart, and if I do some things for you now, somewhere down the line when I need your help, you will help me. So it's these networks of personal interconnections that we all have.
And what is the relationship between knowledge and social capital?
Well, I would say, first of all, that social capital is an essential precondition for moving knowledge from one place to the other. When Larry Prusak and I were working on our book, In Good Company, on social capital in organizations, we discovered and we really felt strongly that knowledge travels over the pathways of existing social relationships. And unless there are those relationships of trust and some degree of understanding, attempts to move knowledge from here to there just are not going to succeed. The other part of the relationship goes the other way. That is, as people with these basic relationships share knowledge with each other, they develop greater understanding and more trust. So knowledge is also a creator of social capital.
Okay, now about the project. What are the main findings of the Knowledge Assets and Social Capital project?
Well, there are many of them. I'll try to talk about some of the major ones. I would say we've found, first of all, that knowledge is shared effectively in the cluster in Peru, the asparagus cluster in Peru that we studied, and developed out of some existing social capital there, and has created stronger networks of social capital and better knowledge. I would say we learned too in that project, and this was something of a surprise for us, that merely sharing clear information can be a very useful factor in building trust and building knowledge. I think too that, well, both that project and the Colombian one, the beginning of the Colombian cluster work, shows the incredible importance of persistence in these projects. When you're talking about building knowledge, creating social capital, and developing them into competitive uses, you're talking about a project that has to go over time and is bound to come up against some significant barriers. So the importance, A, of patience and B, of persistence are both critical. I think those things also are part of what led us to believe that an entrepreneurial vision, that is, some vision of the future, and the persistence and energy that an entrepreneur has to keep going are essential.
Given the lack of trust in most clusters in Andean countries, do you think there is hope for our clusters to be competitive?
I think that there's absolutely hope for your clusters, and I think the Peruvian experience is a perfect example of that. Before we went down to Peru, we were told Peruvians don't trust each other and they don't cooperate with each other. When we talked to Jorge Checa of Athos, he said at the beginning of his attempts to create Frio Ario, this cooperative venture, people said it won't work because we will not cooperate with each other. People don't trust each other enough. Now, going on 7 or 8 years later, there's a thriving cluster and a thriving cooperative organization that's gone from the original 10 members to 30 members, has created additional trust, and I think is is an example that if you have some basis in trust to begin with, you can work from that and, yes, accomplish your purposes.
What are the lessons for policymakers and businessmen of our project?
Well, I think I've answered some of them. Persistence, having a clear goal and the vision to communicate that goal. One of the things I haven't talked about here, but we've talked about earlier, I think especially in environments where people may not believe these kinds of things can be done, telling the story of successes as vividly and as widely as possible, extremely important.
My name is Al Jacobson. I'm a principal of Hartwell Associates.
Why is knowledge the new source for creating competitive advantages?
Well, I think that increasingly what we're seeing is that products and services that we're creating kind of thing have a larger component of knowledge in them that's creating value. It's less in terms of some of the raw resources, less in terms of some of the physical properties, but more in terms of knowledge that becomes really the value creator in terms of the overall valuation of services and products. And that knowledge then becomes very competitive both from a cost standpoint as well as from a servicing differentiation standpoint.
What are knowledge assets and how do you measure them?
Well, I think that there's several categories of knowledge assets, as Don and Larry have referred to. We have knowledge assets, which are basically resources we talk about, such as human capital, education, those types of resources that we use from an outside contacts we might have outside of an organization. And then we've described knowledge assets more in terms of some of the core processes that are involved. So they might involve things like knowledge assets related to being able to sort of search for information, knowledge assets related to how you produce a particular commodity or service. And then there's knowledge outcomes, which could also be considered to be knowledge assets.
How can you use them, that is the knowledge assets, to enhance competitiveness?
Well, I think that knowledge assets become, as I said earlier, kind of thing, if you think about the value of the goods and services that are being produced as increasingly represented by knowledge, the knowledge assets become an important source of inputs into the cost of goods and services. Essentially, knowledge assets become important in the same regards as any asset becomes important in terms of goods and services. I think they either add to the value in terms of making a more competitive cost product or service, or they provide some form of differentiation. It could be differentiation in terms of product innovation or some service enhancement.
What is social capital?
Social capital, again, like Don and Larry referred to, is you think about social capital in the same way you think about sort of human capital or physical capital. It basically represents the amount of trust and confidence, the networks and relationships that exist within an organization. And I think the importance of reciprocity is really a key concept of social capital. The ability to be able to sort of assume that you're going to be able to, expectations, you have similar expectations with one another.
And what is the relationship between knowledge and social capital?
Well, it's impossible, or it's very difficult, let me say, to think about how you could either create or transfer knowledge without social capital. If you think about a situation where there was very little social capital, a lack of trust and confidence in one another, then the opportunities for being able to create new knowledge, the opportunities for being able to transfer old knowledge is going to be very difficult. So you really need social capital in order to be able to sort of support a knowledge.
About the project, what are the main findings of your work in the Peruvian asparagus cluster?
Well, I think that there's several layers or levels of findings. I think most importantly, and at a very general level, I think that the Peruvian work really validated the overall framework that we were applied. I mean, the whole importance of knowledge assets and social capital was very much demonstrated in the Asparagus Project. I think the other finding that was very, very important was being able to identify and show the real value of a cooperative economic activity that was undertaken amongst private owners and the benefits that that had for the rest of the cluster.
What are the main findings of your work at the cosmetic cluster in Colombia?
I think the principal finding, and it might anticipate your next question, is the demonstration of really individuals coming together who, in a situation previously where they didn't know one another or there was a great deal of mistrust, and being able to collectively identify a vision, a goal that they wanted to sort of move towards, and to be able to then identify certain kinds of action steps that would occur in an effort to try to reach that goal. And that was a very important finding.
Did you find that in the Andean countries or in Latin America, there is a higher amount of lack of trust in clusters compared with clusters in the US?
Well, we didn't really do a comparative study between the Andean countries and the U.S. Certainly, we were told that one of the difficulties in terms of initiating and sustaining economic activity in Peru and in Colombia kind of thing was the lack of trust. I think that very well might be true. I don't know how that works from a comparative kind of standpoint, but I think the overwhelming finding that we came across with was that if you take people who are well-intended, goodwill, and you put them in a situation where they have an opportunity to be able to talk about some of the issues, some of the obstacles, some of the problems that they face, and what the opportunities are for being able to achieve a better life and a stronger kind of economic activity, that trust happens. It happens in that kind of situation or context.